this year at the HLF marks a milestone. So it's the first time that we have an HLF alumna return to the Heidelberg Laureate Forum as a laureate. Amanda Randles attended the first HLF in 2013, and she was awarded the 2023 ACM Prize in Computing for her groundbreaking contributions to computational health through innovative algorithms, tools, and high-performance computing methods for diagnosing and treating a variety of human diseases. And we are thrilled to have her back and give the first laureate lecture at the 12th HLF this year. And she will tell us about vascular digital twins from algorithms to proactive patient care. Amanda, the floor is yours.
Thank you all for having me. I'm really excited to be here and very excited to be on this side of things. So I wanted to show a picture. This is from the 2013 event that I had gone to. Was very excited to be there. It was the first time they had been holding the HLF forum. This is a picture from the last day, and that's me, very tiny in the back. I blew it up. It's still, like, I'm so small, it's a little grainy, but I swear I was there, and I look grumpy, but I wasn't. It was amazing. But no, it's been really excited. I'm really excited. I'm so happy to be here to talk to everybody. And I thought I'd start off with just kind of showing a quick version of how I kind of came here and what my journey past HLF the first time. This is just a quick overview of my career so far in one slide. And at the top, you'll see everything from my academic career, and then on the personal side on the bottom. And a note for everybody as you're going through the question session, or as you see me throughout the week, my family is here. You'll probably see them at points. But I'm happy to also answer any questions about being a female in science and having 3 kids. So basically, I started at Duke. I worked at IBM for a little while. I went to Harvard for my PhD, where I studied physics. My master's was computer science, but I'm kind of in the middle of the math and computer science side. I was at Lawrence Livermore National Lab for my postdoc and spent some time at DOE, and that was when I came to HLF the last time. And since then, I've been at Duke, so kind of building everything there, and I'll talk more about some of the research we've been doing there. And that's really led to what we've kind of started now at Duke. The new center we're launching is the Center for Computational and Digital Health Innovation. And I want to talk about some of the work that we're doing there and tell you guys some of the research and how we're trying to build towards digital twins in the health space. The overall mission is to improve our ability to find, to track, and to treat human disease. And we're trying to do that using, combining advances in AI with wearable technologies. We're using augmented reality and virtual reality to provide better ways to interact with the data, have an immersive, more intuitive interaction. And then we're tying it all in with high-performance computing and kind of the advances on that side to allow us to get to much larger spatial domains, much larger temporal domains, and really make more real-time action for these types of digital twins. The overall goal is kind of to shift. Today, what we're seeing is healthcare is very reactive. We treat crises after they happen, and the goal is to have digital twins make it more proactive, so that we can start to treat these crises before they occur and switch to more of a proactive preventative care setup.
This is Lily, born in 1985, first step at 11 months, logged by a baby monitor. At 10, she broke her arm. That cast? Documented, recovery tracked. Teen years, sleep patterns, heart rate, stress, all silently recorded by wearables. At 28, she crossed her first marathon finish line. The crowd cheered. Her heart raced, 187 BPM. By 40, her medical records, nutrition, and fitness history, all connected. At 56, a subtle heart rhythm change was spotted early. No symptoms, just data. The AI flagged it. Doctors intervened, prevented a major event. Now she's 70, still walking, still thriving. Because her digital twin taught the AI how to care for her. This is more than data. This is proactive medicine. This is the future.
This is kind of our grand vision, right? We're trying to create, you're now in a world where everything is being monitored. Many people are wearing wearables. We're getting all of this data. We're able to track patients as they go about their daily lives. And the hope is to create a system that we can actually take the data from across the patient's lifespan and help inform and improve better care. In doing that, we're trying to use digital twins. So digital twins aren't new. They've been used in mechanical engineering and civil engineering for years. This is just one example where we've seen digital twins of bridges. What I wanted to pause here for is just kind of make sure we're all on the same page and make sure you have an idea of what I'm thinking about when I say digital twin. I think there are many different versions at this stage. And so the key piece here is that we're talking about a living digital replica that is tied to that physical asset and constantly updated. So it's able to show this constant status, predict issues, and guide the right intervention at the right time. We currently see these commonly in place. You see it with bridges where you have embedded sensors continuously monitoring and trying to predict failures. We see it with jet engines, where we have real-time performance tracking with companies like GE, where they're trying to find if something is wrong with that jet engine, kind of like a check engine light for air travel to come in and identify that engine needs to be taken in for care before something happens. So they want to know, like, can this engine actually sustain that flight? Is it up to the task, or do we need to actually take some kind of action ahead of time? Our goal here is to create that for patients. So we want to be able to get to some kind of check engine light essentially for the patients that the doctors would be able to check in on and see remotely, non-invasively while you're going about your daily life. And the way we're getting there is trying to build this digital twin in healthcare. So we have to inform it from medical imaging, from that patient's particular imaging. So we need MRI scans, CT scans, we need wearable data, we need the medical history, and we need to find ways to combine all of this together. So we have this living simulation that's not just a static model of that patient, but is really evolving with the patient over time. This allows us to then visualize that patient's anatomy and their physiology in real time. It will let us test different scenarios in that digital twin before we ever touch the patient. So the doctors can try out different surgeries, different interventions, different therapeutics before it gets to the patient and see what's best for that particular patient. It allows us to optimize our decisions for safety and effectiveness. Kind of like the digital twins for jet engines and bridges, it's going to mean fewer surprises, better performance, and more proactive care. So the way we're looking at this is trying to shift from this reactive care, where the current system is, you have chest pain, you go into the doctor, and then they're going to react, and they're going to, take you to the ER, take you to the cath lab, figure out what's going on with that patient. What we want to be able to do is identify these problems when you're still stable, when you're at home and we know that it's coming, and identify it weeks before or days before you actually have symptoms arising. By creating this, it also allows us to do intervention response forecasting, meaning the doctor, before they step into that operating room, can try out 3 different surgeries, figure out different options for that patient, test it for that particular patient, and see what's going to happen. They could try different drugs, different therapeutics in the model, and then run different hypothetical scenarios in the computational simulations to see how is this patient likely to respond if they have different activity levels or different physiological activity moving forward. Try to say, if they start eating better, if they're sleeping better, if that changes it, how is that going to affect that patient? To spend a little more time trying to build a little bit more intuition for this, let's look at a very short-term example. So we have a lot of guidelines about, how, based on aggregate population, about how much and how long you should be running. But what about identifying what's going to make a tangible difference for a specific person? So say you plan to run for 45 minutes today. How do you decide if you should focus on, if you should focus on speed or endurance? Imagine if you had a digital twin who could know your current state, know how tired you are, know how much coffee you've had, kind of understand where you're at today, and assess what the best option is for you and say, today you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck if you just focus on a slow and steady run. We're already seeing the first steps of this with guidance like the resilience feature that you see in Oura Ring and other devices. And now we're trying to take it a little bit further and see how we can identify long-term disease susceptibility and kind of apply this over a longer period. So in the same way that we want to identify what's the best option for you in terms of your running and your workout side, we want to take this a little further and look at someone, over months or even years. So we want to identify ways that are going to make someone less susceptible to something like atherosclerosis. So what you're seeing here is plaque buildup on the walls. we've gotten really, really good at identifying different vulnerable arterial states. So we know if you have low wall shear stress, or you have oscillating wall shear stress and oscillating shear stress, it's likely to affect where you're going to have plaque buildup, how much plaque is going to build up, and identify those locations. But we're really struggling with how to identify, how to convert these over to truly actionable guidelines. And the digital twins capturing particularly blood flow over time are allowing us to not just identify if you're hitting a vulnerable state, but how long you're going to spend in that vulnerable state. So it helps us find ways to try to mitigate against that and reduce the amount of time you're spending in these vulnerable states and address it for that specific patient. Now, to get there, it requires a lot of interdisciplinary advances, and I particularly wanted to put this up in this meeting, mainly because it's going to take advances in mathematics, advances in computer science. We need to be able to deploy this at the edge. We need to identify, bring in uncertainty quantification. There's a lot of the fairness that you see in AI that needs to be applied to this data security. We need new algorithms that are going to be able to get us to much longer time periods. Mainly, there's so many advances that really need to happen across all the fields that everybody here are kind of studying. So one of the takeaways I want you to have from this talk is just if you're kind of looking for that area and where you want to apply your methods, definitely consider the health space, consider the digital twin side, and we definitely need more people and more young minds kind of focusing on this and trying to push it forward. So with that, I'm going to switch into two of the scientific use cases and kind of the case studies we've been working on in our lab. For the digital twin side here, I'll be talking specifically about vascular digital twins. So we're building blood flow simulations informed by medical imaging. I'll go through two quick case studies, spend a little bit more time on cardiovascular disease, and then talk a little bit how we're doing some cellular scale modeling and applying it to cancer. So if you watch this video, this should give you a little bit more of an intuition of what we're trying to build. So it's not just a data-driven model. We're creating physics-based 3D blood flow simulations. This is a virtual model of the patient's vasculature. This is capturing their real blood flow over time, and it ends up being incredibly computationally intense because you're trying to capture flow over time, the interaction of all the red blood cells, the deformation of these red blood cells, and you want this to be in the real vasculature of these particular patients. So we want to be able to understand the amount of time spent with high force at certain locations that could indicate different likelihood of diseases. And bringing this all together helps us start building these large-scale vascular digital twins for these patients to understand, as you're seeing here, the velocity is going to be shown in the corners, and it helps you identify locations where cells are going to be stuck longer, where you're going to see adhesion, and where you may end up seeing plaque development. So what we need to build these digital twins, they have to be patient-specific, and the geometry is really key. So having that patient-specific imaging is a critical component. So we start with the patient-derived imaging, and then we complete data segmentation. So what that means is we identify what the lumen is in each of the Z-stack of someone's CT scan or MRI scan. We go through, identify what those regions are, and then we connect them to get this piece on the right, where you're seeing a 3D. So if you see this video kind of playing, it'll show you how we're doing that segmentation. We're getting these patient-specific 3D geometries. So you get a triangulated mesh file that represents, in this case, the patient's coronary arteries. We then apply a regular Cartesian grid. So we're solving Lattice-Boltzmann for our fluid dynamics equations. So you're just applying a regular grid and then trying to identify what's inside the mesh, what's outside the mesh, what's an inlet node, what's an outlet node, and solving those fluid dynamics equations at each of those grid points. This ends up needing an incredibly high resolution for the simulations. So we end up using some of the world's largest supercomputers for some of these simulations. And now, in order to make the digital twin to really track you as you go about your daily life, the next stage is connecting it to wearable devices, using those to inform those models, and then creating these longitudinal hemodynamic maps. So that gives us a 3D blood flow over long periods of time so we can try to assess what's happening for that specific patient. So kind of taking us to how we use these, the first step that we mentioned was really trying to find and diagnose the diseases easier. The canonical example that's really used in the field, and I would say this is more of a digital model than necessarily a digital twin at this stage, these digital models are already replacing invasive measures. We're seeing examples where you see FDA approval. They're being deployed in companies not only in the US, but all over the world. The canonical example being used here is for coronary artery disease. So when you're seeing a plaque buildup, so you see the yellow in that coronary artery, you have a stenosis that's occurring. The way the doctors are going to identify if you need to have a stent or not is they put a guide wire invasively in your coronary artery. They measure the pressure before the lesion, so before the plaque buildup, and then after the plaque buildup with a pullback method. And then they just take the ratio of those two pressures. And if the ratio is above or below 0.8, that's when they decide to give you a stent. It's called the fractional flow reserve. And there are many companies and examples of using this, where the goal now is to create a digital twin, a virtual model of that patient. And instead of using a guide wire to measure that pressure gradient, we're measuring the pressure gradient that we get in that specific model for that patient. And we're able to match very strongly what you're getting from that guide wire. So this was from a study we had done working with Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, in Massachusetts, the United States, as well as at Duke University. And we were able to show that we got within about, I think at most, like 6% error compared to the model of what, compared to the computational model and what we were getting with the guide wires. What I think is almost more interesting is that we were able to find other markers. In this case, what I'm showing you is vorticity. And what we found is that patients that were right on that borderline, so if they were just over the 0.8 marker and they would not have gotten a stent, if they had a high vorticity, they were more likely to have adverse events down the line. So what we're showing is that there are metrics that you might not be able to measure directly with these invasive conventional methods, but if you're using the digital models, you can actually get access to more fidelity, more markers, more descriptions about these patients that actually help us stratify the patients better and identify patients that maybe should have gotten a stent but otherwise wouldn't have. We've also gone on to apply this to heart failure. So I think that this is one of our newest studies led by Justin Geddes, one of our postdocs, and now a research scientist who's leading this heart failure study. The key part with heart failure is they have an implantable device where they're trying to measure filling pressure. Filling pressure will actually change a few days or a few weeks before you actually have any kind of symptoms. So before you start having any chest pain, your filling pressure will start to change. The doctors can identify it with implantable devices remotely, and they can step in and change the therapeutic care remotely and help the patient, or if need be, they can have them come in already based on what they're seeing from those measures. But obviously, this is an implantable device. It can only measure once a day when the patient is lying down. And what we're trying to do is build this digital twin to not only be able to match these devices, but be able to take it to where you can capture it as you're moving about your daily life and be able to find other earlier symptoms. We've taken that first step where we've worked with the Duke Hospital and identified that this digital twin and digital replica, where you're taking a CT scan of the pulmonary artery, and then matching with a virtual simulation, we can match what you're getting out of those implantable devices completely remotely using these models. And I mentioned here Harvey, which I guess I haven't mentioned yet. The CFD tool that we're using, we've called Harvey, named after William Harvey, who figured out that the blood circulates. But you'll see that kind of throughout the model of this is the tool we've been building for the last 15, 20 years. And then the next step is moving into how do we actually track. So we have a way of getting accurate models. We can identify the diagnosis, but now we want to move it to longer periods of time. So we want to be able to track the disease. We're witnessing currently this pivotal shift in healthcare, which is driven by the rise of wearable sensors. Sorry, I just touched the microphone there. Which is driven by these wearable sensors. So one of the questions, it's kind of hard to see with everybody, so maybe I'll see if I can see you. So if anyone here wearing an Oura ring? I have my Oura ring here. Okay, I'm curious what's going to be most popular here with an international group. Is anyone wearing an Apple Watch? How about Garmin? Okay. Am I missing one? Fitbits? Okay, this is interesting. There's not an overwhelming. So mainly, everybody has at least some kind of device on them, and if not, you probably have your Apple, your iPhone, or your Android that's also at least tracking your step counts. The metric, the quote that I like to use is, in 2022 alone, there were 115 million registered Apple Watch users. We are seeing a huge adoption of these kinds of wearable technologies. We're suddenly in a point where we can actually track all of this data, see what's going on with the patient when they're not in the doctor's office, and really be able to inform these models. The key part from our end is that traditionally the doctors had to rely on data that they're collecting over short periods when you come into the hospital or when you're in the doctor's office, and it's really looking at small snapshots in time and trying to predict what's going to happen. The fractional flow reserve we were looking at, they measure that over 1 heartbeat, and they're trying to identify what your ischemic risk or ischemic burden is based on that 1 heartbeat. What we're really trying to do is move this to understand what's happening over longer periods of time. One of the key problems with this is, because we have the wearables, the nice thing is this is the first time that we've ever been able to, we've had the need to run for long periods of time. But coming back to the video that I had showed earlier, this was from 2010, but the key point here is it took 6 hours on the entirety of the world's biggest supercomputer at the time to model 1 heartbeat. Trying to move to, let's get to weeks or months, just waiting for the next biggest supercomputer isn't going to be enough. And we needed to have different types of different algorithms developed and different ways to kind of move forward and identify how we could do this. Luckily, I work with really smart students that are willing to try crazy ideas. So this was Cyrus's project where he introduced this parallel in time method. We call it a longitudinal hemodynamic mapping approach, but basically it's taking parallel in time, breaking down the temporal causality into tiny units that we're calling hemodynamic units. When you identify these small units, we're kind of saying, at the end of the day, your blood flow at like 10 a.m., there is a point where it's not going to affect the blood flow, maybe at 10 a.m. the next day. So you have these small chunks you can model, my blood flow today at 11 a.m. versus, my blood flow tomorrow at 11 a.m. may be somewhat similar. We might be able to model it once and kind of put it back together. So we set up this algorithm to try to break these apart. We then also changed the model so that it could be run and driven from the wearable devices. And then we locked down our cluster at Duke for probably about 4.5 months to explicitly model the blood flow simulation using a conventional approach. Before this, the longest 3D flow simulation that had ever been completed was about 30 heartbeats. So our goal was to really push that forward. By locking down the cluster for about 4.5 months, we were able to hit about 750 heartbeats. We did that, and that's what you're seeing as the black line here. The green line is what we're getting out of the LHMF that we ran in AWS for significantly less compute time, and we're able to match what you get from the explicit model with about less than 1% error and really extend the amount of time that you're able to model. We then took it further and have run simulations capturing about 6 weeks of someone's time. It's maybe a little hard to see, but you can kind of see the flickering of the wall shear stress at the top. And this allows us to get about 4.5 million heartbeats. This is particularly interesting because what we would have done before is we take a single resting heartbeat that's a representative resting heartbeat, or maybe a representative exercise heartbeat, and that's how we would try to make decisions. Whereas looking at this longitudinal hemodynamic map, it gives you a real view of how much time was spent in these different vulnerable states, and it actually ends up being statistically significantly different from what you would get using resting heartbeats or a representative exercise heartbeat. So it gives you a much better view of how much time was spent in these vulnerable states. In this case, we're defining it by having wall shear stress less than 1 Pascal, which is associated with the localization and progression of heart disease and plaque buildup. Then to move into how we actually use these to treat, the digital twins can be very useful, as I was mentioning, for trying out different interventions. So if we have surgeons that are trying to figure out, what's the best way to treat this patient, we can give them this tool, and here's an example where we're seeing bifurcation lesions. So you have a lesion both in the main branch and the side branch, and they're trying to figure out which lesion do I need to treat, what's the best option as we go forward. And they can actually go in virtually then and test out different options before ever stepping foot in the operating room and identify what's the best stent to be using. Do I need to stent both of them? Do I need to only stent one of them? And try different options for that particular patient. It's hard to tell here, and I'll show in a minute, but this is also written in Unity, so they can also do all of this in extended reality in a much more immersive manner. This provides them with a real-time and intuitive approach, which we then connected to a machine learning method that allows us to predict the results in the fluid flow based on the changes that you're seeing in the intervention side. And what you're seeing on the right-hand side is showing the accuracy of the machine learning model. So we call that our Harvey virtual intervention. And the key piece here is by combining the machine learning with the fluid dynamics results and this interaction, it's reducing the lead time where we no longer need, previously other machine learning models needed about 24 to 48 hours to train. And then after they trained, you'd have real-time feedback for those patients. But now we're able to train in about 10, 15 minutes. At a minimum, it allows it to be on the same day while the patient is still there. And it really changes how the doctors can interact with the data. And even more so, you'll kind of see, and the top right should be a little video if that starts playing, but it's, you can kind of see there's the full body vessel kind of in there. That's an image from the Vision Pro. The bottom left is is a Z space, so it's kind of one of the 3D monitors that you have with the glasses. And it allows us to really give, you have the bottom right is showing it in the cave where you could really interact with the data. It allows the clinicians to see this in a much more intuitive, immersive way. And we've been trying, we've been looking at a lot of different user studies to understand when is this helpful and how do we make this most usable for the doctors in a way that they can interact with. Oh, there it's moving a little bit. Sorry. Hopefully you can kind of see there's a full body vascular model that you can actually take with you and interact with easily, like in that Vision Pro, which can be incredibly helpful. Okay, now I want to take a few minutes. Oops. Okay, I want to take a few minutes and switch over and just talk a little bit about the cancer cell side and how we add the cellular model, and then I'll open up for some questions. So when we're working on the cellular side, everything I've talked to this point, you only really need bulk fluid models. But a lot of the diseases, we're starting to look at how the cell-cell interactions are going to affect the trajectory of the disease. Specifically, we've been focusing on cancer metastasis and understanding the progression of cancer and why a cancer cell, once it rips off the primary tumor and is moving through the vasculature, trying to understand where it's migrating, why it's spending time there. But we're also starting to work on questions like, how red blood cells change as you're aging and how that's affecting disease and how the biomechanics of different cells can really affect the disease states. In that case, you really need to have a model that has a fidelity enough to model the specific red blood cell shape, the membrane properties, and really capture not only the large-scale fluid dynamics, but all the way down to the smaller grain scale. When we build these models, we start with just trying to model one cell and making sure we can get that one cell very accurate. I think obviously one of the things whenever someone's showing these computational models, you want to kind of understand what we did to validate it. For the red blood cells, we mimicked things like optical tweezer experiments, micropipette experiments, and we worked to understand which constitutive laws were necessary to really capture the membrane dynamics. What you're seeing on the top on that graph is just trying out different constitutive laws and trying to identify what the best way to model these red blood cells are, how we actually capture the membrane mechanics as we go. The one on the bottom is trying to tune this and show that we can tune these models to specific cancer cells and actually capture different cancer cell movements. So this is a collaboration with Scott Manalis's team up at MIT, where they have their SRM device where you're seeing the cancer cell kind of go through, and it kind of which is represented by that yellow, and it goes through that constriction and gets he's looking specifically at the passage time of these different cells. What you're seeing on the bottom is the experimental side, and then what we're getting on the from our model on the right. And what was really exciting was the graph you're seeing on the right. Everything in blue was the TMET cell. Everything in orange is a different cell line, and we're able to use Harvey to really distinguish and tune the cancer cell model to match the properties of each of these cells to really understand how different cancer cells are moving through these devices and get correct models as we go through. And in this case, we ended up, we added in cytoskeleton models, we have different nuclei models, and trying to test this to see what was necessary and what was needed to actually accurately capture the dynamics of the cells. I tend to work on the large-scale parallel computing side, and so one of the things that we were looking at next was how do we actually capture this over long dynamics. Kind of similarly to the other models, just waiting for a bigger supercomputer isn't going to be enough. If we do a standalone explicit fluid structure interaction model, you need such a high resolution that this was using Summit at Oak Ridge National Lab in the US a few years ago. It used to be one of the biggest supercomputers in the world. It had about 24,000 V100 NVIDIA GPUs. Using the entire thing, we were able to model about 550 million red blood cells, which is exciting and a huge number of red blood cells and a really, a good step forward in cell modeling, but still only a very small subset of what you would want if you're looking at the whole body or even just this upper branch, trying to understand and track a cancer cell moving through the body. This limited us to a cylinder of about 3.1 millimeters. So we're in a really small domain, even if we're still getting 550 million red blood cells. So we started figuring out how do we approach this, and that's where the mathematics side of the house is really helpful. We're identifying new algorithms, which we refer to as our high-resolution moving window. So we have this method here, where basically, and obviously it depends like what kind of question you're asking and what you're interested in. When we're really interested in one particular cancer cell and how it's moving through the body, we center the moving window on that cancer cell. The red blood cells are captured within that window. And the hypothesis here is that the orientation of the red blood cells is really going to matter right near the cancer cell. So it's going to hit the red blood cells, and that's going to change how it's going to interact. But the specific orientation of the red blood cells 10 centimeters away isn't really going to affect how that cancer cell moves. But the bulk viscosity that you're getting and the overall fluid motion that you're getting from the existence of those red blood cells is important and does need to be taken into account. So we have a bulk fluid simulation that is coupled to the window simulation. And you can kind of see this is the high-level view of the algorithm of just we're capturing this window as it moves through the geometry that allows you to get those cell-cell interactions on a much longer time scale. We show that this works using an expanded channel. We filled it entirely with the red blood cells. And then we ran this explicit fluid simulation. So we did an FSI model where we explicitly modeled all of the red blood cells. And the interesting piece and why we picked an expanded channel is that as soon as it gets through that expansion, you'll see that cell starting to marginate and go closer to the wall. If we didn't have the coupling working correctly for the moving window, you would imagine if you just saw the moving window at the bottom, it wouldn't know that it was in an expanded channel. It would continue just straight through the cube, and you would see the cancer cell kind of just going along the center line through the middle of that extended channel. Because we have this coupling working correctly and you have the overall bulk fluid simulation being run on the CPUs that is being coupled to the GPU model of the red blood cells, it is telling the simulation for the window what's happening in the rest of the geometry and allowing it to take that into account. This has then allowed us to move much farther, and this example is just showing just maybe going about 5 to 6 millimeters. We could do that in only 96 node hours, again, on AWS. And it only took about 500 node hours to move all the way along this cerebral vasculature domain. Just keep in mind, we were trying to do this explicitly. Just to go those 3.1 millimeters, we needed about the entirety of Summit, which was 4,600 nodes, and we needed at least 1 hour to traverse that entire geometry, so it was at least 4,600 node hours compared to this 96 node hours we were able to get as we moved using the APR window. So everything I've talked about today has been on the vascular digital twins, and I want to point out, kind of as we come to the end, that we're having growing data on a per-patient basis, from genetics to immunology to neurology to information about bones and joints. And the goal is not just to have the digital twin of the blood flow side, but we really want to include data from all these other systems, and I think that's where we're going in the next few years. And kind of bringing back to the beginning and the video all about Lily, if you remember her, our goal is to break down these data silos. So the way care is happening, at least often in the US today, you go to your cardiologist, and then maybe you go to your oncologist if you're having other issues, and you go to your neurologist, and they don't always connect as well as you might want them to. And they kind of, the cardiologist is there to treat the heart disease side of it. It is not always seen as a whole patient, and we're trying to shift this to the whole patient view. And not only just the whole patient of what's happening now, but really capturing what's happened in your entire lifespan and what might have happened, when she broke her arm when she was 10, did that really affect things, and how it may have recovered and how that may have affected her 20 years down the line. So we want to find ways, obviously you can't just give this big stack of data to each doctor, and we need to find ways to analyze it, combine it together, and really help the doctors go through that information. So the goal is that in the future, we won't be asking if you have a digital twin, but we'll be asking how your digital twin was really helping keep you healthy. And we see this is actually happening in the next few years. But the only way to get there and to make this real and to have these breakthroughs is to have more advances from students like you on both the mathematics and the computer science side, really helping us push forward on the healthcare side of things. So with that, I'll end with acknowledging my amazing team and all of our collaborators that we've worked with us, and I'll try to open it up for some questions.
Amanda, thank you very much for an amazing talk. And we have time for some questions, so we have a catch microphone here and there. We can start with Sanjeev, who is already, and then go in the back.
What was not clear to me was if it's simulation-based. I mean, it reminds me of the weather, but there's only one Earth, and so with enough simulations, DeepMind was able to train a deep net to do quick predictions. But here, it seems like the simulation and the effects depend on individuals, and so it's not clear how you would aggregate data across individuals to have fast predictions for one patient. Can you say a little bit more?
Yeah, so we're trying to draw in data, we're drawing in data to aggregate across patients and looking at population, but a lot of it really is focused on the individual. So it's for the blood flow side of it, it is taking, optimizing it so that we have, at the end of the day with the hemodynamic units, we can identify there's a minimal number of hemodynamic units per patient. Once we have simulated those, if we have your wearable device, as long as your CT scan is still valid, so it also, we have to be able to predict 2 items to see when has that, when is it no longer valid and when have you had, when do you need to come in for more imaging. But it's getting the simulations and being really tied to that specific patient. So it's, maybe drawing some inferences from population-based, but a lot of it is more patient-specific. So it's doing specific blood flow simulations for, in your geometry for your patient, for that patient.
It doesn't scale. I mean, there's
So that's where we're trying to work on it, where it's as long as you're wearing a wearable and you have had the imaging side, then it doesn't require a huge supercomputer per patient. But then we are trying to do some of the inference on if you don't have the imaging. So right now we're focusing on all the diseases where you would have CT scans, we have that image. If you're trying to go for just general health, then we would need to have representative geometries, which we can get to for generally healthy, generally healthy 40-year-old male kind of thing. We can get inferences on that side, but for anything where there are targeted diseases like heart failure and the coronary side, you really do need the images.
Can you throw the mic there? Hold it very close to your mouth, please, because, yeah.
How do you validate some of those metrics, like I think you mentioned vorticity, that can't be measured empirically?
That's a great question. So a lot of it, like vorticity, you can derive, you can derive a lot from velocity. So a lot of our validations, we started with velocity, and we also started with more. We started with 3D printing the model so that it was somewhere that was controlled. So we made sure, we know everything about what's happening in the model. We ran blood flow simulations that did particle image velocimetry, and then we compared what we were getting out of our models to what you're getting in the experiment, and then have kind of built up to where we're now comparing against things like the implantable devices in the patient. But that way you kind of have that spectrum of in the patient, there are always, other pieces that we may not be able to measure. But then we have a lot of work with microfluidic devices and the experiments where we can really control everything.
One of the questions that I had was, and I know this is for the future, we were talking about how long it takes to do the computations for this data, and obviously, yes, you can't run a whole supercomputer for every single person, so you're going to have to make assumptions. Down the road, I was curious about what type of solutions you might have for pre-existing conditions. Because the way I envision it is that there's a living simulation and that builds as you go and makes more predictive, and then it takes steps. But what if you found out in your 40s that you actually had a pre-existing condition? Do you envision it going back and reevaluating all the data and reevaluating why things may have happened to try to correctly predict?
And that's a good question. I think that is something that would definitely need to be taken into consideration. Hopefully, it depends on the model. So a lot of things like if you have diabetes or other conditions that occur, it changes it changes your boundary conditions, and it'll change your microvascular resistance. That a lot of times we can measure other quantities where you might not know why it was occurring, but you can make sure your model is capturing that patient specifically. We would have accounted for those boundary conditions, but we might not have known that it was because it was diabetes or something on that line. So for some of it, when you're trying to make those decisions, it may have been there, but then we need other approaches like using machine learning tied in with the electronic health records to help identify why did we have to make these decisions. But then there may be other cases where you have to go back and rerun some and see does this change what we were expecting and what's happening. A lot of the way we see this being deployed is really kind of predicting two things that can be measured from the wearable devices. So the thing that you're trying to measure, whatever you're trying to identify or predicting to say that that's our biomarker, but then something that can be directly measured as a calibration to make sure your model is actually usable and accurate at that stage. Because we also need to identify, has a stenosis developed? Is your medical imaging valid or not? And so that as long as you're keeping this calibration piece in mind, I think that would limit the amount you have to go back and re-simulate, but it is something we'd have to take into account. It's a really good question.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Just what about for other things that may be harder to measure, such as like the musculoskeletal? You're not going to have a device on you measuring how your joints are moving. I mean, maybe impacts, like if you fell, but I am curious to see what type of solutions it might do.
No, and I think as we move from just blood flow, we'll have to take into account more of these things as well.
Thank you very much for, again, being here and giving such a wonderful laureate lecture.